Please welcome back to the stage Tiffany Taylor, President, ASU+GSV. And please welcome her panel, Joseph South, Chief Innovation Officer, ISTE+ASCD, David Coronado, Director, Invention Education, Camsie McAdams, Director, Institute for STEM Ready America, STEM Next, and Liz Texeira, VP, Social Impact, ASA.
All right, so welcome back. I hope you had time to connect and reconnect with leaders across the ecosystem, and I hope you're excited to continue the conversation. But before we dive in, I want to take a moment to just reflect on where we've already been. So this morning's conversation made it clear. The future of work is evolving faster than ever, and to think differently and boldly about how we prepare our learners for what's next is a requirement and a responsibility that we all bear. And it's, again, not just about tools, adding programs, it's about designing learning experiences that align to a bigger vision that is rooted in access, agency, and opportunity, and that's exactly what this conversation is going to highlight and focus on today. And so we just heard from Joseph, who reminded us that in the age of AI, our uniquely human skills are more important than ever, and that powerful analogy of making sure our students are not just playing instruments in the orchestra, but they are conducting it is something that deeply resonates with me. So, as we dive into this conversation, I just want to remind you who we have on stage. You already met Joseph South, Chief Innovation Officer at ISTE and ASCD, helping to build the future of digital learning ecosystems. We also have Camsie McAdams, Director at the Institute for STEM Ready America, with decades of experience spanning federal policy, out-of-school time, and large-scale impact. We have David Coronado, Director of Invention Education at the Lemonson Foundation, leading the charge to expand access through inventive mindsets. And we have Liz Texeira, Vice President of Social Impact at ASA, working to expand access, equity, and opportunity across education to career pathways. One more round of applause for these folks. I know you're sleepy, but let's get some energy going a little bit. All right, and like this morning, folks, again, we really want to make sure we invite your voices, your reflections, your thoughts, your ideas into the conversation. So please, whatever mode works for you, take some notes, write on a napkin, type in your phone, whatever works, let's make it happen. So we are seeing a real divide in education right now. So we have some schools that are rushing to adopt AI tools and some that are banning them completely outright out of concern. And both sides seem to have some sense of certainty that they're doing the right thing. And so, Joseph, what do you see as the deeper issue of both enthusiastic adopters and cautious resistors? What are they missing when it comes to AI's role in STEM education?
Yeah, so I think the first thing I want to do is just acknowledge that there are real risks associated with AI. And so for a parent or a school board or a teacher to come and say, hey, this is moving faster than I feel comfortable with, I think we should expect that. Yeah. And we do need to make sure that we put those in place. We don't want to rush into a technology that hasn't been optimized for learners. On the other hand, the learners are going to need to use this technology in their future. So we also can't ignore it. There was a panel, a school that had brought together a panel to talk about AI, and they had teachers on it and parents and a student. At the end of the panel, the student said, can I just say one more thing? And they're like, sure, student, say whatever nice thing you want to say. And they're like, you guys are going to make your rules and your policies, and that's good, and I know why you're doing it, you care about us, but we're going to have to use this in our job. And so we're going to be learning to use AI and using it regardless of what your policies are. And it wasn't the student like trying to do a power play on the parents. They're just trying to help them understand the reality of where they're headed. Yeah. So I really feel like we need to mitigate the risks, but we can't do that by just banning it.
And Camsie, you know, you've worked at every level, right? Classroom teacher, federal policymaker, and you have been working to really reach millions of young people, like all with that perspective of what is the fundamental challenge that you think people often overlook when they talk about STEM education, and particularly the gap that exists?
Well, thank you, Tiffany, and thank you to all of you. And I feel like We're doing pretty good in terms of eyes up, considering a lot of people had more than one brownie or cookie. So I'm just kind of like judging the field to see, have we like hit, are we still in the sugar high or are we in the glucose down?
Yeah.
So, you know, I spent 25-ish of my more than 25 years in STEM education really thinking about what happens in schools. Right? So I was a classroom teacher, district administrator, worked at the federal policy level, really thinking about how to expand opportunity and access. And if you had asked me this about a year ago, I would have said that. Yep. But the things that we're missing are opportunity and access, right? So it's about creating opportunity. If you're in the school system, creating the opportunities for your young people, bringing them worlds that they've never known before. I worked in ed tech. That's part of the job in ed tech, is to bring the world to classrooms, right? But now, about a year in, focusing solely on the out-of-school time space, I would say that all of those years spent really thinking about how to crack the code on STEM education really underestimated the power of what's happening outside of the classroom walls. If you only concentrate on the 6 hours a day, I was just talking about this with my table earlier today, that kids are in school, plus you got recess, and transitions, and lunch, and specials which sometimes do and sometimes don't add, you know, academic or enrichment, you're not left with a lot. Plus you have district mandates and testing requirements and assemblies and all kinds of other things. The out-of-school time represents such a huge opportunity for all of us to think about how to be, A, really creative and really develop that curiosity mindset, and B, to develop a different kind of relationships. And I think that the thing that, if we were up here and this was in a STEM ecosystems, as if this was like arts integration ecosystems or world language ecosystems, we would all be thinking, what's the common denominator? It's relationships, right? So in the out-of-school time space, we develop relationships with young people differently because it's about nurturing their interests and nurturing their paths towards learning. And I think that that's a place where all of us can just think, no matter what your field is, if you are working in the K-12 day, think about your partners in the out-of-school time space or informal learning environments. Think about your museums, think about your community learning centers, think about summer and the weekends. And these are all opportunities for us to sort of fill in those gaps and fill in those crevices, because that's where, I think my colleague Anita said this earlier in one of the questions, is 80% of a child's waking hours are actually not spent in the school day. So my answer now would still be opportunity and access, but let's think about how to push ourselves beyond the walls of the school into the spaces that young people already take up.
I love that. I love that. And David, just building on that, you know, just as a first-generation college graduate, and we talked about this during the prep, who's now leading national Invention education efforts, you've seen both sides of the access equation. And so when you walk into traditional STEM classrooms, what dynamics or patterns do you notice might be unintentionally limiting students?
Yeah, good question. I think there's an assumption here that there's actually a STEM course to walk into. So I think, you know, I love the community. We've been talking a lot about STEM, but there are a lot of communities who don't have STEM. And if they do have STEM, it's basic math or science courses, and they're not pushing them to their limits and really challenging them and giving those opportunities to grow those mindsets, right? Grow those opportunities for learning for the future. So I always talk about that, number one. Whether you're rural, low-income community, we still have a major access issue for the quality STEM education we want all children to have, both in school and out of school, right? The second thing I always think about is there's a gap, and there's a lot of gaps, so we can spend all day on this one. But I'll just point to this particular one. I appreciate the CSOs that are here today because we often don't hear the student voices, right? We as adults are speaking for you and thinking about solutions on how to help you advance in your education. And so one of the things I did was I looked around and did a lot of research, and oftentimes the research is filtered through adults, including teachers, right? And so we partnered with Education Week to think about, let's actually do a survey straight to young people around what are the gaps What are the barriers to motivation and learning? And let's actually hear from you versus having the data filtered through a teacher. And so one of the major findings that really stood out for me was 59% of the students that were surveyed, 13 to 19 in schools across the country, found that they were felt they were highly motivated for STEM, 59%. When asked educators what they thought of students and they're being highly motivated towards STEM, only 10% felt their students were highly motivated. So if you think about the folks that are working with our young people, if they don't feel, or district officials and all sorts of folks, right, don't feel like students are interested in STEM, then why are they going to advocate for resources or begin to teach STEM? So that's the gap we have, I think, in ideology and opportunity, is if we can bridge that gap better, then I think we will see more opportunities for young people. But I think we have to find ways to encourage young people's voice to be brought more to the classroom so we can fill this gap and this void around, they don't want it, but yes they do, because when my teen is not listening to me and he's on his phone, I say, he's not listening to me. But 2 weeks later, we'll see something, he'll bring up that concept later. So I do think we have a gap between adults and young people, and we really need to listen more to young people around opportunities for change in their communities.
I appreciate that, because I think there's a gap definitely in listening, right,
Mm-hmm.
and understanding what their interests are, but I also believe that part of that gap is like catalyzed by a lack of belief in their capacity and ability, right, to acquire the skills that we believe they need to be successful in STEM education, and that is why it funnels up as, oh, they're not interested, because if there's an inherent disbelief in their capacity. And I think that's something that we need to acknowledge and disrupt in a real meaningful way. So I appreciate you lifting that up. So Liz, you've led at every level, federal policy to state leadership to philanthropy. When you walk into STEM classrooms, if they exist in the school, where students are building, coding, and problem solving, what do you see as the biggest gap between those learning experiences and what students actually need to do to succeed in innovation-driven careers?
Thank you. I love this question. First up, who is an educator in the room? Who identifies as an educator? All right, hands up if you're K-12. Hands up if you're higher ed. How about policymakers? How about nonprofit professionals? All right, so this is a good group, and you always know you're in the right spaces when everyone's taking your talking points, right? When we think about gaps in classrooms, we think about using STEM within classrooms. We at ASA call that work-based learning, right? Career-connected learning, in which students are taking advantage of relevant, meaningful, real-world learning. When we think about the gaps right now in classrooms between what they're experiencing in the classroom, if they have one, and what they actually need for the real world, is first just acknowledging there's a lot of good stuff happening in classrooms. But if we had to think about gaps, I think about it in 3 different ways. One, we have some systemic gaps, right? When we think about K-12 and what we're offering for students in K-12. We have some partnership gaps, right? I'm specifically thinking about partnerships with out-of-school providers, thinking about partnerships with families, thinking about partnerships with employers. And then the third is around skills, which has already been talked about a little bit. We tend to over-index in some of those harder skills that we've kind of always done, because that's how we were trained. And we're thinking less about those durable skills that little people need now to navigate a new and unclear future, right? So when we think about this kind of problem of work-based learning, we also do a lot of national survey work. And out of all of our young people, in a nationally representative survey last year called our Teen Survey, 79% of those young people said that they wanted to participate in some sort of work-based learning experience. They want career-connected learning. They want to start trying before they buy. But out of that group, only 34% knew where to go to find that opportunity. So like right now, we see this huge unmet need for work-based learning within a classroom because they need that in order to be successful for whatever future career they choose to opt into. It is very difficult for a young person to get a sense for what the world of work looks like if we're not giving them tangible hands-on experiences to do that. So when we're in classrooms and we're seeing work, right now we really have to make sure that we're paying attention to relevance. Is this something that kids are actually going to be using when they're in their future careers? We have to be thinking about, is it meaningful for them? Is it a part of the broader ecosystem that they want to live within? When we think about these partnership gaps, are we actually bringing employers to the table to tell us what our young people need to be preparing for? Right now, the world of work and workforce is changing so quickly that it's not possible for any of us to be reading the tea leaves appropriately. Which brings me to my third point around skills. What we really need to make sure that we are doing right now is making sure that young people know how to figure out what comes next. How do they find information? How do they become empathetic? How do they learn how to pivot and be resilient and have grit in, again, a very uncertain future? So I think there is a lot of good stuff happening currently, but there are a lot of adult problems that we can fix pretty quickly here if we think about systems, partnerships, and skills.
I appreciate that, and I would love to just hear from you. Jan and I were having a really great conversation earlier today, and we talk about our K-12 leaders, our classroom teachers, and sometimes we jump all the way to the superintendent, and now we're talking about the state superintendent in a very different way than we have in the last 20 or 30 years. But there are other adults, to your point, Liz, in the space and other partners. What about the role of school counselors and the role of state boards? Like, how do you think they fit into this education as we're thinking about readying, right, the next generation of leaders in this evolving time?
I don't think you can underestimate the fact that school counselors are woefully overworked and extremely underrepresented, right? So lots of schools have one counselor for 400, 700 students. Some share between campuses. So when I used to be in charge of STEM for DC Public Schools, this was one of the things that we tried to do when we were implementing the Common Core Math or Next Generation Science Skills. Could we touch all adults who were going to interact with young people, right? So that we could get everybody on the same page and everybody using the same language. But often those folks are super overworked and you're running into the same problem that David talked about, which is, do we even have that opportunity? The board, though, is an interesting space because there's so much local specificity there, because some boards are elected, some are appointed, some are include student representation, to your point, some include families and parents, to your point, that's a partnership that might be missing. And I think that this is a place where the ecosystems is such a brilliant model because it draws on the specificity of the local, right? So as I'm talking to people from Idaho or from Philadelphia or from Kansas State or from Kentucky, I'm hearing things that are so specific to their municipalities, to their local regions, and that's why I think the ecosystems is such a great model, and why those folks can then lean in on the counselors or the school boards or the parent groups that are active in each area.
I would add here, I was talking to a state superintendent. I do a lot of time just listening, asking questions and listening to what folks are going through and needing. I won't say the state, but I was talking to that state superintendent. I said, what is it that's the most critical issue to our community, right, to our state? And one of the things that I talked about is the school boards have changed in composition over the year. And as power is driving back to the states, it's also driving back to local boards and making decisions of what should be funded or taught or not funded, right? And so we said one of the things that's happening is these are not education experts who are on the boards as we used to have. They've been traditionally used to being people who are really experts in the field, who have brought their knowledge and then aided the school district in making decisions. Today they represent great people, right? They represent students and families in the region, but they don't have that educational expertise. And so we said one of the things we actually need to work on is help our education board provide them with additional training and knowledge as a resource to better understand what we're trying to achieve and to bring that knowledge to them so that they can have better informed decisions and not say no STEM, don't like that, because they're based it off what they read versus how are we educating to understand this is what is enabling students, this is what's most effective, and please vote yes on that next time. So I do think we're going to have to go from the state level on down to regional school boards and helping them understand what is it that's actually effective and best for our children.
I want to stick with you for a moment, David, and I want to talk about our children. I want to talk about our students. We often talk about the importance of competency, what are they learning? We need to make sure it's rigorous, there's substance there, but we also talk about mindsets. What shifts do you think need to happen for students to see themselves as inventors and problem solvers and creators? And how does that shift show up and how they show up in STEM learning spaces?
Yeah, I'm glad we're having more conversations around mindsets, right? Dispositions of people. Because often when I was going to school, and we're seeing it today, there's a really focus on careers that are going to disappear or may not be known, right? And Joseph was presenting earlier around mindsets. The first three were some technological pieces, but the majority of the rest of them are just ways of being. And I talk about operating system as my analogy. If we don't have the right operating system, you can't add new software. If your operating system's outdated and can't add more to it, then how are you going to grow with the times? So I think about, we need to be teaching more to that. And so I spend a lot of time thinking about what is it that we want to teach? We're teaching a way of being. And how do you teach a way of being? More practice. And so I think about, with ChatGPT and all sorts of stuff, I hang around teenagers a lot, and they're like, I don't need to know content. I'm just going to go right away and spit out the content. But what we're seeing is AI will not necessarily know how to use that content without telling it what to be creative about, what to think about, how to be empathetic about it. So we're spending a lot of time thinking of, we don't want everyone to be an inventor, but we actually want people to be change makers in whatever capacity, right? When we think about our education, we may have done a specific major, but we may not be doing the major we actually studied. Yeah. But we were all given an upgraded operating system that has enabled us to change with the times over multiple years. I mean, some of us are working 40 to 50 years in our career now, but can continue to reinvent ourselves. So when we talk about invention education, it's not that we want you to create inventions. I would hope you do. Everything around you has been invented by someone, but it really is around changing mindsets of people seeing the world in such a way and understanding complex problems and being able to solve them. And that's going to translate to any career. And that's been the ask for corporations for years. They want people who are creative, right? Open-minded. They want to be empathetic. They want to be team builders. They said nothing about specifically knowing around particular content areas. There's some basis and knowledge for that. It's very important, but also it's how to use that content in a way that actually is transformative. So that's where we're spending more time around to talk around invention education, which is that approach to helping kids see problems and solve them. And bringing together all that knowledge of STEM knowledge and putting that into practice so they learn how to use the tools to solving problems. And that's kind of what we've been focusing on. Because when you build those mindsets, then the kids are enduring and they will become adults and they'll endure as adults. And I think we'll see less of this conversation, which is communities. We taught them a particular skill, but we didn't actually give them a good education. And so now they're wondering, how can I transition? How can I change? That's not who I am. But if we can transform kids to think about this is who I am from the beginning, we enable them to have a better future for themselves and hopefully for ourselves and our country and our world.
So we spent a little bit of time just talking about what the gap is. We talked a little bit about the importance of partners and career connectedness and the types of skills and the importance of mindset. And each of you are leading innovative strategies and work in your own disciplines and in your own companies. But a lot of the times we're trying to figure out how do you scale. And so Joseph, would love to turn to you as we shift gears a little bit to talk about full-scale implementation. So from your experience, not how do you scale, but what are the conditions that allow transformative STEM models to take root and actually scale across systems? And we all know how complex a district can be. So what conditions need to be in place before we start putting these innovative strategies into gear?
So I think it's really appropriate that we've talked a lot about relationships, because I think the most important first thing is you have to have a shared goal, and that tends to coalesce around shared values. And it's easy to rush into the what we're going to do part, but if you aren't in agreement on what you're trying to accomplish and the values behind it, then it's really hard for those things to be sustained. And I think a lot of the reason that some of our initiatives sort of live or die by the leader, right? As long as that superintendent was here, it was amazing, and then they were gone, and now it's gone. It's because we haven't invested the community. We haven't taken the time to invest with the community in the work. And so you just can't overestimate coming to a shared understanding, coming to shared language, coming to shared values, having that be the basis, and then building from there.
I love it. And not doing that in a performative way, right? Because having a shared understanding is different from sharing power and decision making, right? And I think sometimes we miss that step in the equation, and that's where we get to the superintendent leaves, the whole project is over, and the impact is gone. So I appreciate you lifting that up. And so Liz, you live and breathe through powerful coalitions in your work and have done so for some time. When you think about sustainable cross-sector collaboration, what lessons have stayed with you?
So many lessons. So Tiffany's referring work to the federal level, the state level, in classrooms, in nonprofits, in higher education for a spell. And I'm gonna sound again like I'm just kind of ripping off of the talking points here, but relationships are what drives this work. If we're, again, this group is a group of educators, right? Either across K-12 or higher education, you know that. Building coalition, again, it is all about the relationships and the strength of those relationships. We hear that relationships move at the speed of trust. That's a very real thing. Whenever you're trying to get people from different organizations, agencies, groups, agendas to be working together, taking the time to get to know them, taking the time to understand where they're coming from, what their goals are, what their values are, that is actually going to be the best time that you can spend. Because as seats change, administrations change, different roles change, people stay consistent, right? We just sit in different seats. Relationships are, I think, a huge core driver of this work. But in addition to relationships, you have to have systems that back up and support those relationships. So developing some actual concrete systems to support the ongoing development of partnership is incredibly important. I think back to my time in state government, and we had a weekly meeting across education, labor, and our higher ed team. Every week, we got together to talk about kind of shared goals and priorities. That was a system that we set up because we realized that if it wasn't on the calendar, it wasn't gonna happen. The next part about that system piece is codification, right? We talked about it a little bit. How do you keep an initiative from going away as soon as the leadership changes? You do it by codifying good work, right? That can happen through policy, through executive order, through legislation, through budgets, right? We hear all the time that budgets reflect values. Thinking about how to codify good work once you actually have a replicable model, that is incredibly important to making sure that those relationships have something to stand on, right? When those people change, if you've locked it in and codified it, that's a way to kind of keep it, I think, consistent. The last thing I will say is about being able to be nimble, right? We are in a time of unprecedented change. Everything is changing every single day. Our labor market information, the jobs that are available to us, the tools that we're using to do our work and our jobs, our young people are growing up in this world. So making sure that when you have those relationships, you have the systems that support those, that you are nimble enough to pivot when the time calls for it, to listen to your young people, to understand what they are saying that they need, to listen to your partnerships, and to be able to kind of adjust to new information. I think that's really essential for keeping this coalition work going.
So I'm going to call audible and just roll with me for a second. I want to ask everyone in the room to either take out your phone or to take out a piece of paper and a pen. And I want to give you 1 minute to just simply reflect on this question. Why are you here today? And when you think about the conversations that you've been in over lunch, in this panel room, in the breakout rooms, what is it making you think about the role you have to play when you get back to your respective community? So what made you say yes to coming to this convening? And what is the role that you believe you have to play when you get back to your respective community? And I'll tell you why I'm asking you to reflect on that. So I'm gonna give you 60 seconds, and I got a big old clock right here in front of me, so I will make sure we stay on time. And as you wrap, and I see some eyes lifted, so I know some of you are back with me. As we listen to these final questions, I want you to listen through the filter of your own why and the work and the responsibility that you feel committed to taking on when you get back to your respective communities. So I want to, again, make sure that as we close out before we turn out to the bigger group, help us understand when you think about the leaders in this room, they are coming to us from all over the country, district levels, industry, policy. When you think about the work that they are charged to lead in their own communities, what's one priority that you would encourage them to start with if they're really looking to lead transformative change in STEM education? And Liz, I'm going to start with you.
Ooh. If I had to pick one priority, I think it would be making sure that you are truly centered on what your young people are saying, right? The reason that we are doing this work, yes, we can talk about the economy, we can talk about national labor market information, we can talk about ecosystems, but at the end of the day, we're in this work for young people. So making sure that you are centering them in your decisions, centering them when you're thinking about how to develop programming, how to measure things, how to develop metrics, how to set up these systems, how to further relationships, Keeping young people and those voices at the center of those conversations, I think would be my priority.
So one of the things that I want to talk about all the time is career-connected learning. So we've heard it in, I think, almost every session that I've been in. And we heard it this morning in the opening panel. We heard it in the session that I was in on pathways. I heard Liz say it. We talked, Joseph started talking about it. And I think that the priority around whatever it is that you're doing now, where I'm at STEM Next, we're really focused on career-connected learning. And when we say that, we mean being thoughtful and deliberate and making these little shifts that are not incremental change. It's not like tiny little things that eventually are going to add up, but it's more about deliberate shifts, right? So if you think about your own prioritization, whatever you wrote down or whatever you reflected on as your why, just to be very thoughtful and deliberate about that, to be intentional. So I know we're at our end, but I'm going to share a tiny little story. So when I first started teaching, I was in Oakland, California, and it wasn't Common Core math, but it was still new math, according to all the parents that I taught. This young child in my class, Maurice, he wasn't doing well. I brought his dad in to talk to me. Maurice's dad was flummoxed. He was like, I don't know how to help him. You teach math so different. And I was like, sir, you are a plumber. You literally live math. Like your whole life is math. He's like, no, not the kind of math you're teaching. I'm like, what do you think I'm doing up here? This is 6th grade. Decimals, fractions, percents, bring your tools in. Yeah. Let's do it. So this gentleman came in, brought his tools, brought out all the socket wrenches and all the little, the different attachments. And these kids were so into it and he felt so proud, right? Because his career was something to be lauded. Yeah. A plumber, right? Not an engineer, not the guy from NASA who goes to church with me, not my dad who's a retired geologist, but this guy who had what he thought was a regular job. Now, I give myself credit for bringing him in, but I don't give myself credit for being consistent about it. It was very scattershot. Over the years, I've been very here and there. If I came across the opportunity and I sat next to David at a conference and say, hey, do you want to come talk to my kids? Do you want to come be on a panel? Do you want to do a mentoring thing? And I wasn't thoughtful and deliberate. So my message to people, my priority would be thoughtful, be deliberate, be intentional, right? So whatever's on your why, for me, career-connected learning is something I'm really focused on. Make an effort to make that be part of what you do and make sure that you come back to it again and again and again. And don't just do a little drop here and a little drop here and a little drop here because it's not going to work for our kids. They need more and they need better from us.
Hi, David.
Yeah, I think just listening over things over the last couple of days and hearing on this panel around people and relationships. And so I think sometimes we get our heads down and we start working in our community and our issue, but we actually don't look up and see who's not with us. So I'm encouraging people to really think about who's not at the table with you and to think about who you should include, who should be part of your STEM army, right? That's really advocating for this work. Who's not likely to be in your community and bring them in. I also see folks in different ecosystems may not collaborate as well with other ecosystems because there's, funding constraints or there's time, it's travel, but encouraging folks to start linking up your ecosystems in a very deliberate and collaborative way, right? State-based ecosystems really unite around common metrics, ideas, outcomes, create a movement in your state. Think about Billy, you're thinking about ripples, you're throwing rocks into a huge ponds these days in oceans. But it's going to take a lot of water molecules coming together to generate the momentum to actually have sea change in your state. So encouraging you to bring more people to the table with you, and not just STEM people too, right? There are ecosystems of ecosystems everywhere on education. Start pulling those people into the conversation and unite and create a movement around change in your state and your region. I think that's what we need to do, is pick our head up and start finding out who we should be working with to really build that tidal wave, that tsunami that's really going to have impact.
All right, Joseph.
Wow, that was inspiring. I'm thinking in terms of purpose-driven expertise development. So really helping young people identify a purpose that's meaningful to them and of consequence to the world around them, and then helping them develop expertise that's aligned to that purpose. Because I think when you bring a young person's intrinsic motivation, how they want to be in the world that they want to create, and you can align that to developing expertise that matters to them, you really pull together the human parts of this work with the technical parts of this work to build something new that matters to them.
I love it. And so I hope folks took note that no one spoke to a tool, a platform, or a program as the first priority, right? We talked about the importance of purpose-driven leadership development, inclusive roundtables, right? We talked about the importance of intentionality and then making sure we center student voice. And so it's